Let us begin in the name of the Father, the Son, and of the Holy Spirit. God, our Heavenly Father, your Son is the Word who has spoken to us. We ask you to bless us with an understanding of this Word, to understand what it is that you want us to know about you. Help us, Lord, to be open to all that is known. Help us, Lord, to be open to what we do not know. And we ask these things in the name of your Son, our Lord, Jesus Christ. Amen. When we look at the cultural milieu and the language that produced the Gospels, and not only the language that produced the Gospels, but the life of Jesus Christ, Jesus Christ is, pretty much early first century, Mediterranean, Middle East. And then, if he dies around 34 or so, give or take, then we don't have Mark written till 69, Matthew and Luke around 85, and John not till almost 100. So a lot of years have passed. And the writers are not only having to reflect on the culture and the life of Jesus as he would have known it, because they have to do that because that's not their culture. They didn't grow up in the Mediterranean Middle East, influenced by it. So they're trying to move from capturing the experience of Jesus and the people of the day to capturing the people of their own day and their own cultures. With Mark writing and having traveled with Paul, writing in Rome, culture is different. And they're going down the street, and a woman crosses the street against the light. And that cabbie put his head out the window, and he said, my Arabic is not very good. However, I understood enough to know he called her everything but a white woman. I mean, he just let her, he was screaming at the top of his lungs, his vein out of his neck. He was turning, beet red as he screamed at this woman who didn't look at him, who didn't react. She just kind of went on her way, got across the street, and then zoom, he's off again. And he turned around and said, "Well, how's your family doing?" As if nothing happened. It went from 0 to 100 in anger, and from 100 to 0 in anger in a matter of a second. And so they're much more expressive of their anger. They can turn it on, they can turn it off. In terms of that emotion, in terms of emotions in general, in Western culture, men aren't supposed to show a lot of emotions. We're not supposed to cry. We're not supposed to necessarily be sentimental. In fact, wives, girlfriends will brag on a man who shows the least bit of being sentimental. Oh, he's a little sentimental. I just love that in him. No. Whereas in the Mediterranean Middle East, men are expected to be effusive in their expression of emotions, then and now. Men are so expressive, and everything is, so many more things that we look askance at, they don't. They'll walk down the street holding hands. And they consider that an extremely masculine thing to do. We see two guys walking down the street holding hands in Franklin. We just kind of, just keep on walking. But so it's very, very different, that Middle Eastern culture and our culture. Looking at how men are today is a great snapshot of how life would have been with Jesus. Anger could be real, or anger could be manufactured. And when I say manufactured, it's you would show anger to make a point. You might not really be angry, but you work yourself up to look angry. That was a technique I learned in the classroom when I first started teaching. Even though I wasn't the least bit angry, if I started to sound angry, students just kind of, we made him mad. Because I'm a person, I rarely raise my voice. Rarely. And usually if I'm raising my voice, it's with an inanimate object. My computer, my vehicle, my phone. Commonplace in the Middle East, very commonplace. So when we see examples of Jesus being angry, especially in the temple, throwing people out, there's sort of a question, okay, was he emotionally angry, which a Middle Eastern male would have no trouble expressing, just scream at each other, and the next thing you know, they're having espresso in the coffee place. But also it could be sort of drama, sort of street theater, if you will, and we see Jesus utilizing that quite well. The most important thing to understand about the Mediterranean Middle East culture is that their system of, or their sense of status is totally different than our own. Their whole sense of status is based on a system of honor and shame. And we see this constantly in the Gospels, this system of honor and shame at work. We may not recognize it as such initially, but it is there. For us, status has to do either with wealth, position, who your family is, where you live, what kind of car you drive. We have all these different ways of calculating another person's status. That meant nothing in the Mediterranean Middle East of Jesus' day in the first century. Money had nothing to do with status. Your position had nothing to do with your status. Who your family was had everything to do with your status, because honor is rooted first and foremost in the family. They could not conceive of existence outside of the family. You were part of that family. And the worst punishment that any family or society can inflict on another person is not torture or not death in their minds, although I would consider torture and death pretty substantial. For them, in their mind, the worst of all punishments was to be exiled, because you could be thrown out of your family. And at that point, you have no status. Nobody's going to talk to you. Nobody's going to relate to you. If you don't have a family, you're a nobody. If you're exiled from your town, you're a nobody. People are associated with their family, then they're associated with their town. How many times do they refer from Jesus being from Nazareth? Born in Bethlehem, but being from Nazareth. Constantly. Jesus will talk a lot about, Jesus' mothers in the Gospel of Mark, Jesus' mothers and brothers, they hear that Jesus is crazy. And so they go to get him. Why? Because if he's crazy, he's bringing dishonor to the family. And they couldn't stand for that. So they have to get him out of there to restore their family's honor. And then what does Jesus do? He uses the moment, to say, they say your mother and your brothers, they're outside, and Jesus says, who are my mother? Who's my mother? Who's my brothers and sisters? It's not them. And then that would have been, jaw-dropping, because everything begins with the family, and Jesus is denying his family. Oh my God, this is, it would have brought, there could have been 1,000 people there. I'm sure there wasn't, because those houses weren't very big. A Mediterranean Middle East, the Jerusalem house of the first century would probably be twice as large as that stage at best. And the back rooms were not living spaces. They were for the animals and for storage. So, you would have 5-10 people in a 15 by 15 room. That's where they ate, slept, fixed. Food was never prepared indoors. It was always prepared outdoors. But for Jesus to say that, it would have brought a silence to the whole crowd. But then what does he do? He said, those who hear the word of God and keep it, those are my brother, my mother, my brothers, sisters, family. To understand that the family of origin is everything is essential to understanding that Jesus creates a new sense of family. We're family by faith, not by blood. And that is an idea totally unknown. They almost can't even conceive of it because there is, we say, well, he's such an individual, or she really has self-image problems. And there was self-image. What is that? They had no concept of self-image because your image is always defined by other people, primarily your family. They did not conceive themselves as being individuals. They didn't act as individuals. They always acted as members of a larger group, starting with the family and then the tribe, and they still had a tribal sense, in that they knew, or you the tribe of, of Joseph, you the tribe of the 12 tribes, or, you were from the tribe of Naphtali, or so family, town, tribe, all of that determined who you were, what your status is. In the Gospel of John, and in that status, if you had no family, you were a nobody. Well, that was particularly hard on women. And when we hear women and orphans, an orphan is not just defined as a child without parents. An orphan is a man or a woman without a family, regardless of age. If, let's say that all of a sudden, my mother died, let's say I had no siblings, I've got some extended cousins, but essentially my core family, nobody exists. Therefore, even as an adult, I would be considered an orphan and have no status. So that, it's incredible. So here's Mary at the foot of the altar. Here's the beloved disciple at the foot of the altar, or at the foot of the cross. Same thing, sort of, but at the foot of the cross. And, we look at it from our Western eyes with this sentimental thought of, look at Jesus taking care of his mother. Woman, behold your son. And here's this beloved disciple, sort of this loving kind of act, son, behold your mother. We look at it as Jesus making sure his mother's going to be taken care of. Because for women, it was not only family, they were defined and understood by the men in their lives. Their father, their husband, or their sons. Those are the ones who gave status to a woman. Well, at that point, we presume, probably, and I'm sure correctly, that Joseph is dead. Being that the average age is 35, her parents are dead. So here's her son dying. So here is a woman who's going to be totally without status. None. There's no men in her life anymore. Here's the beloved disciple. We don't hear anything else about his family, but the notion and the feeling we get from the Gospel of John that he too is alone. And so on one level, John binds the two of them together to make sure that they have some status. Now Mary has the beloved disciple, and the beloved disciple, who's not named in John, but we presume is John. Mary and John, beloved disciple of Mary. So it sort of creates a little, okay, now Jesus took care of them. Now they got status, they have family. But it didn't work that way. That would have meant nothing to the people at the foot of the cross, because that's not how you establish relationships and family, just by bonding people. Now, people bonded all the time for the sake of survival. So it goes back to, say, in the Gospel of Mark, when Jesus asked the question, who is my mother, my brothers, my sisters, those who hear the word of God and keep it? In the hands of John, knowing that's not how family is constructed, and status is established, knowing the only way Mary could have gotten renewed status, the only possible way she could have gained any status once more. So in the hands of John, using this reality that what looks in our eyes to be this great intimate moment of Jesus loving and taking care of his mother, but that's not how families are formed. That would have meant nothing to the people at the cross, meant nothing to the people reading the Gospel of John. But what would have meaning is that Jesus is creating a whole new sense of kinship. Again, going back to the Gospel of Mark, he's creating a whole new sense of family. And this is just radically different from anything that has existed before. So to understand that sense of family and faith, this is a very radical notion that Jesus gives us. And we can only know that because we know about family. In this whole system of honor and shame, one of the roles of women was to increase the honor of the men in their lives, increase the honor of their fathers, her brothers if she's not married, of her husband, of her son. And honor was increased by things that people saw you do. The good things they saw you do, the things in that society they were regarded as noble. That would increase honor. Shame is to act contrary to those good things. The part and parcel of that system of honor and shame, they absolutely eschewed. They hated secrets. If they found out you were harboring a secret, they regarded that as a shameful thing to have secrets in your lives. We laugh and talk about our family secrets. We don't want anybody to know them, because to know the secret is to be shame, to bring shame. In their culture, to keep the secret is to bring shame. When we talk about towns, there are not a lot of secrets. Nazareth at the time of Jesus was maybe 300 people, maybe. There's high schools that aren't that big. Classes, there were, my senior class, there were about 175 of us. So the town was only a little bit bigger than that. And, if you went to a smaller high school, by my senior year, except for maybe some of the freshmen, I knew the name of everybody in school. Because it's not huge. It's Notre Dame High School in Chattanooga. So I knew the name of, except some of those freshmen, and who cares about freshmen? Unless they were playing a sport that I was involved in, or which, and trust me, I was not God's gift to athletics, or in any organization. I really didn't know the freshmen that well. But in Nazareth, everybody would have known everybody, and to some degree, be related. Maybe not all first cousins, second cousins, but most of them would have been kin somehow, in the larger sense of family. So the reality is, in a town that small, do you think there are any secrets? No. And in fact, they hated secrets so much that all day long, they left their doors and their windows open. Of course, they didn't have glass or any, their windows or anything, but everything stayed wide open as a way of saying, go ahead and look in all you want. There are no secrets here. So everything was open. Everything was above board. If somebody in the family did something, and if your honor comes from everyone else's sense of your family, one person in your family could do something that would be considered shameful, and it affected the status of the entire family. Really. We've had it said to us by our parents, or maybe we've said it to our children, you've embarrassed the whole family. You brought shame to the whole family. Well, yeah, we or somebody embarrassed the family, but we don't think of the being shamed. It's like, oh, did you hear what Tom Moore's kids did? And they talk about Tom and his wife a little bit, but that doesn't change their status or their friends. It just gives other people more to talk about, But if a child of Tom Moore had robbed a bank, I figured he was, but I was going to say, if you have any trouble, I do exorcisms, okay? Well, I would say the Moors enjoy a great deal of status, respect, within this community, within the business community, larger community. But if a child of theirs had robbed a bank, that family would have lost all status. We probably wouldn't even let them back in the doors of this parish if their child did something. If their adult child did something, not even living with them. I mean, that sense of, because everything was family, for one person to damage the family to the extent that that family's no longer welcome anywhere, that's honor and shame, and it's a very, very powerful thing. Jesus uses that. Mary uses that. And the greatest example of seeing a woman at work using the honor and shame system to increase the honor of her son, husband, father, son, is at the wedding feast of Cana. That the notion, there's this whole rule of hospitality that the Jewish people lived. We see that present in the Gospels. That was one of the highest and most important virtues, was the practice of hospitality. That, we see Abraham, these three men passing his camp, and he stops them, and he makes them stay and eat at his tent. And that if he had let them go without an effort, it would have shamed him, because here are these three strangers, and of course it's a nomadic tribe. They're probably not actually out in the middle of the desert, because they have sheep, and they've got to be where there's grass and pasture land and all of that. So, they're probably in a very, very nice place. But yet he stops them, and he makes them stay and accept his hospitality. And the converse is just as important. That if someone offers you hospitality, you dare not refuse it. I keep going on those little rabbit trails. There's a little codicil to that. If you invited someone, they used a system of double invitations. And we see that when the king invites people to come to the wedding feast, and he has to send out a second time, the invitation. We see that several times where there's a second invitation issued. But you never accepted the first invitation to a social event, a party, a religious thing, with another family. You didn't turn it down. That would have been shameful, because you were expected to accept another person's hospitality. So, if, the Stacys invite me over to their house, I might say, well, I'll have to check. I might be busy, and we'll kind of get back to it. So you don't accept the first invitation. Why don't you accept the first invitation? There's the little, the towns they live in, but the invitation may come from somebody in another town. You have to have time to come to find out what their honor status is. Because if their honor status is below mine, I will turn down their invitation. Because if I associate with them, it brings my honor status down. If you're invited somewhere and somebody with a greater honor status invited you, oh my gosh, you couldn't wait hardly for that second invitation, because you were going to say, yes, 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 what time? Because to associate with somebody of a higher honor status raised your honor status. Jesus talks about people fighting for seats at the table, places of honor, because if you're next to somebody who's more honor, that has a higher honor status, that raises your status. So yeah, they're fighting for seats of honor, not like fighting for the seat at the head table, fighting for seats of honor to be next to people that are higher up the chain than they are. For Jesus to say, go to the lowest place, what? Yeah, you got to be crazy. I mean, that notion, they couldn't even wrap their heads around it, because that's not what you did. And then, of course, Jesus, and this is really very funny, because you see Jesus, first he says, go to the Lord's place. He's talking about humility, and they're not, they're balking at that. We don't want to do that. So what does he do? He turns it into kind of this funny exchange. And he says, yeah, sit at the lowest place and wait for the host to invite you to come up higher, because that will increase your honor. Even if the host says, move up 3 seats, the fact that the host has recognized you in front of other people, that increases your honor. So Jesus is able to take that system and turn, and so now he's really trying to tell them to be humble, but he turns it into kind of a joke as it becomes a strategy for gaining honor. And, so we're allowed to kind of chuckle at that when we hear it. Jesus is pretty sly, and Jesus he used Middle Eastern Mediterranean humor all the time. We don't see the funny side of Jesus, but he had it in spades. And by the way, then I'll get back to I'll kind of backtrack, get back to where we were. What was the place of honor at a banquet? It was not sitting next to the host, because they ate laying down on their left side, because you never used your left hand to anyone bread to eat with, but not wheat bread. You either used barley, and then I forget what the other grain is. They had a third grain, which was really kind of down the scale a little bit, that mostly that grain was used to feed livestock, but the really, really, really poor would make that into bread. It was sort of bitter tasting. It wasn't the best stuff in the world. Bread was the only utensil, and almost everything was sauces. Not a lot of solid food except for fruit. So the table was round, and you didn't have individual plates. The food was in the middle, and you would tear off your loaf of bread, and you would dip it in a bowl, and you would eat it. The way they did it, and it was also considered. It was a sort of a faux pas if you dipped your bread into a bowl with somebody else. You always dipped independently. So you sort of waited, you saw your chance to get your hand in there, dip something out. The only time you dipped your bread in the bowl with somebody else at the same time was somebody that you're very intimate friends with. Now, men and women didn't eat together, so it's not like, okay, a husband and wife can do it together. No, men and women never ate together. Complete separation of the sexes, almost complete. And sometimes when I read how complete it was, I thought, how did they have babies? Because they didn't even sleep in the same rooms, so this huge separation. Man, I'm sure a lot of teenagers like to know how they got together, because their parents are watching them all the time. How'd they get away with it? But so it becomes very significant everything we see in those paintings, like Da Vinci's Last Supper. Everything we're seeing is a great record of dining at a medieval kind of meal, totally different in the time of Jesus. But as we back up to the wedding feast of Cana, we see Mary playing out her role as a good Jewish mother, the best. And the system of honor and shame is written all over this. It looks like the host, the groom, has run out of wine, or is in the process of running out, because of their understanding of hospitality. And remember, the wedding feast was not a 2-hour reception after the wedding. People traveled from town to town and miles, to get there. Camel, burro, or on foot. So there's no showing up for the wedding, going to the reception, and going back home, because they may have walked 50 miles to be there. And so they stayed for a long time. And the groom or the groom's family was expected to find a place for everybody to stay, and they didn't have inns the way we conceived of inns. An inn was if somebody had an extra room, somebody, not a place you went and paid money money and stayed. So, they would arrange for people to stay. And the wedding feast went on for days because you had to feed these people morning, noon, and night. And by the rules of hospitality, you did these things. If you ran out of something, like the wine, and, in terms of beverages, they had water, which was the most common drink, milk, arm in arm, and they're doing, these Jewish dances. That's it. That's the way they did it. But Mary catches on. They're separated, but Mary catches on. They're running out of wine. Now, typically, it was considered shameful for a man to talk to a woman in public. Unless at an event like this, you were speaking to your mother, your wife, or your daughters. Then it's like, okay. Any other man talked to Mary, that'd have been bad. Jesus would have to protect the honor of his mother. There might have been a fight for Jesus. They required revenge. And so if somebody shamed Jesus' mother, Jesus would have gone after him tooth and nail. Would have been sinful? Not in their culture. In ours, yes. But in Jesus' culture, no, because it was an expectation to defend the honor of his mother. We would say, oh, Jesus couldn't do that. That'd have been a sin. Not for Jesus. Remember, it's their culture. It's not ours. But anyway, that didn't happen. Thank goodness. We don't have to deal with that theologically, morally, spiritually, or any other way. But he says, woman, what business of that is mine? Now to our ears, woman, what is that to me? It's like, oh, that's a little insulting. Except it's not, because the way you addressed a woman of honor in public was to call her woman. That was the honorable way to speak to a woman that you were allowed to speak to, a woman of honor in public. Now, if she had no honor, you may say, hey, you hussy, but so he uses the most respectful term for a woman of honor. So, the fact he uses that term tells us something about how he sees his mother. Now, Mary ignores his statement. She doesn't respond to the question, what business of that is mine, or so what? Mary grabs the waitstaff and says, do whatever he tells you. She's putting him in a position because his mother has told these people do whatever he tells them. She puts him in a position where he has no choice, because we don't tell our mothers no. And especially in that culture, a son never said no to his mother for that kind of request. You didn't do it. And it was public. So it would have brought huge shame to Jesus not to do what his mother said. So she essentially, she could have said, in this culture, you go out to the liquor store and you buy more wine so this guy doesn't run out. But it didn't work that way. She is asking Jesus to save the honor of the groom. To save someone else's honor was the second highest way of gaining honor for yourself. So Mary, acting totally, in the culture, has put Jesus in a position of increasing his honor. It's the second highest way honor is to save the honor of someone else. The highest way of saving someone's honor is to save their honor, and it's anonymous. That the person whose honor you're saved doesn't know it. But remember, there are no secrets. So the person whose honor you saved may not know what happened. We know the head waiter went and said, what are you doing? This wine's better. You save the good wine till last. So even the head waiter doesn't know it. But other people do know it. And because they know that Jesus is not publicly taking credit, it's considered anonymous because he's not taking public credit, even though other people know. That is the absolute best way for you to increase your own honor, was to save the honor of another person, and yet it's anonymous. The other person's not even aware you did it. Now, if the other person is aware you did it, that creates debt. For them, debt was personal. Debt was not a monetary thing. Debt was a personal debt, because it's not truly a monetary society. So if the groom had known what Jesus did, then the groom would have had a life debt to Jesus. And Jesus doesn't want to, we can read into that spiritual and theology. Jesus doesn't want to create debt, because to create a debt means that whatever the groom did to repay the debt was obligation. And God doesn't want obligation to repay him. God wants free will offerings. So, God doesn't create debt. God doesn't relate to us in a debt way. And again, this is a new concept, a totally new concept. So, Mary puts Jesus in a position to increase his honor. And in so doing, this is not her motivation, but she accomplished the same thing for herself. For her to get her son to do it increases her honor. But what's clear is that she isn't about her own honor. She's increasing the honor of her son. So that's written all over that wedding feast of Cana, how the whole honor system works. We see the honor system working as well in the life of Jesus. The number one way you challenged another person was through questions. That became, if you wanted to challenge another person's honor, it was sort of a way they debated. When we debate, we state fact, counterfact, fact, counterfact. Well, they asked question the question, question the question that questions the question. And they don't necessarily give each other answers. They're waiting to see who can ask the question that cannot be answered, at least not without tripping yourself up. So that's the way they would challenge each other. And we see that all the time. The Pharisees questioning Jesus, Sadducees questioning Jesus, the scribes questioning Jesus. And all of these questions are meant to challenge him. Now, on the one hand, if you were asked a question like that, which was a challenge such, you had no choice. You were expected to answer the question. You were expected to answer it, unless you could respond with another question. And Jesus does both. We see him respond, but Jesus was a master of answering a question, but not necessarily the question that was asked. He would put our politicians to shame at their debates. How the interviewer asks a question, and they give an answer, but it really is not an answer to the question they ask. It's an answer to a question the politician wished he had been asked, or she was asked. But you had to directly answer the question, and sometimes Jesus does. And if he can answer it properly and in a way that satisfies the question, it increases his honor and decreases the honor of the questioner. So you had to be careful when you did that, because you could lose your own honor, if you lost this kind of debate. So we see that functioning, quite a bit. Something totally different. Clothing. How did these people dress? Their men and women basically wore the same kind of clothes. The undergarment was called a tunic, and men and women wore the same undergarment. They didn't have underwear the way we conceive of underwear. It's just, think of a slip. A tunic would be woven, usually of some kind of linen. Usually it could be, animal skin, it could be something else, and typically, they would make a big piece of cloth, they would bring it to the middle, sew it down the middle, and cut holes for the arms. That's typically how tunics were made. We know that Jesus' tunic was seamless, and there's a huge deal about that being seamless. I have to back up to explain this. In their mind, everything in the world was divided between either male or female, masculine or feminine. Everything's divided along those lines in the way they thought about things. It was not strictly a grammar thing. It was a worldview thing, how things functioned. The public arena was considered a male space. The home was considered a female space. The middle of the synagogue was a male space. Around the top of the usually they stepped down, they dug down and built these steps that you sat on or built up. The top ring around the seats or a different space with a screen was the female space. And everything is divided along these ways, and it's sort of how they understood the world. When you make cloth, and their looms were really not any different than the looms of colonial America or anywhere else. You have two main, you've got this big loom. You have two main pieces. You have the warp, which is that thing that goes, kind of back and forth. It goes back, and then the shuttle goes through with the thread, and then the warp comes back, to tighten up that weave. Well, the warp was considered female, feminine, and the shuttle is considered male. And there is a sexual innuendo there. But anyway, that's the way they conceived of it. So when men were the primary weavers, in the story of the fall, original sin, Adam and Eve are naked. They are in the most natural state, and nobody thought anything, they didn't think anything about it, standing naked before each other, before God, in their totality, nothing to hide, innocence at its absolute best. They ate from the fruit of the tree, and what's the first thing they realized? They were naked. And then he makes a fig leaf covering. She makes, basically loincloths, really. We see, pictures of Eve, kind of with the loin, the fig leaves up here. Well, there wouldn't have been fig leaves up here. The way it's described, they made loincloths. And so Adam went off and made his. Eve went off and made hers. To see them making clothes separately is a way of saying now, it's the best way they have of saying now, man and woman are now divided. Because it's not the warp and the shuttle working together. Male and female working together. It's not that. They did their own thing. So it's a way that Genesis is telling us that part of the consequence of the sin was divide men and women. But what does God do? After he asked them the questions, God made clothes for them out of animal skins. God made them clothes. And in so doing, for God to make clothes and give the clothes to them is a way God has of saying, I am really angry with you, and here's your punishment, but I still love you. And it's a way of God saying to them, okay, you made your own fig leaves, you separated yourself from each other, but you didn't separate yourself from me because I made the clothes you're wearing. So with that act of God making clothes for the couple, clothing comes to be seen as something sacred. And it's not only, it's a sacred thing, but it also meant that, they realized they were naked, and in their mind and, of the plan of God's balance, they thought public nudity was the absolute most, it was just among the most shameful things. You just never, you never showed yourself in public naked. Of course, we think, well, of course not. But we need to remember in sports, they played all sports naked. They did a lot of things naked. And really had underwear the way we conceive of it. Sometimes if they had to do something, they would take their tunic, wrap it up, wrap it around, and tie it, and that was it. So when it says Peter came out of the boat lightly clad, it probably means that he had taken his tunic off and tied it around his waist. But public nudity, bad. made us clothes. God intends for us to wear clothes. So they regarded clothes as a necessity of life. Clothes were as necessary to life as food and drink and housing. In fact, wearing clothes was even more important than housing. Had purposes. Keep you warm. Depending on how you wore it, it could protect you from rain. It could protect you from sand blowing around. It also, if you weren't at home, it was your sleeping bag. Cloak was I mean, that's the word. I mean, cloak is more valuable than their money. And the rule was, if someone, if you give someone your cloak as collateral in a debt, you were expected, if someone gave me their cloak as a collateral for debt, I was expected to give them their cloak back by nightfall because they needed it to sleep in. So an unbelievable important garment. And of course that's, in some of our art, we see the tunic underneath and we see the cloak. They could dye the cloak different colors. Colors, not enough time, but colors had sort of a symbolic thing themselves. The cloak or the tunic would oftentimes have tassels on it, some kind of thing. And so, the woman, that wants to be healed, if I can just touch actually the cloak, not the tunic, said, if I could just touch the tassel of his cloak, so it'd be decorated a little bit with tassels, but also had some religious meanings attached to them. They could wear a belt. Belt could be either another piece of linen cloth or a belt could be leather. And obviously, you got to cinch your tunic up and, kind of keep it all together. And, but also, if they put the belt on the outside of the cloak, they would gather their cloak up, they'd gather the belt around, and sort of pull the fabric up. Now they have, because these things didn't have pockets, so now they've made pockets out of the cloak, just tighten it up, pull it up a little bit. Now you can stuff stuff in there, you can put your money pouch in that cloak, you can carry food in that cloak, it's that's how they would do it. And again, these were the standard garments for men and women. They could cut them a little differently, and in fact they would a little bit, so it looked a little more feminine, a little bit more masculine. Tunics typically didn't have sleeves, but they could have sleeves. Sometimes that gave a sense of this person had a tunic with sleeves, probably a little more wealthy than someone else. And then in the headgear, it's what we see in the Mediterranean Middle East now. They had a piece of cloth that they used. They either wrapped it around their head. If you were really good at it, say you get a little more into Asia, it made turbans. But you'd wrap it all around your head, and then men would put a headband on there. And we see that today. They put a headband, which would hold it on their head, and they could do a variety of things with it. In a sandstorm, they could pull it across their face and all of that. Women wore scarves, wore the headdress also, but a woman was not allowed to wear a headband. That was a masculine thing. So typically when we see statues of Mary and other women, we don't see that top headgear. We see it as, we call it a veil, this headpiece. And, so it hung. And the notion of it not having a headband, because women would never let a stranger see her face, a strange man, she didn't know him. So if she went out to the well, when the men were still there, and there were times of the day the men were at the well, there were times of the day that women were at the well, women would Men and women didn't associate in public, so Jesus talking to the woman at the well, that is a scandal. Oh, geez, that's why the disciples get back. They're astonished and they're scandalized. Oh, my gosh, Jesus talking to a woman in public, and he's not related to her. It was a big deal. But, if it had been a woman would immediately grab and cover her face. She didn't show her face, and we see that still in Islam, but a woman never showed her face to a male she did not know, or oftentimes to eligible bachelors. Of course, they were all arranged marriages, but not entirely. A woman could do that. Now, there was a veil, and it's not considered the top piece. A veil had the sole purpose of a woman wearing it around her face so nobody could see her face. That was the sole purpose of a veil. Which, today, women wear veils to mass, and they kind of hang down, more of the mantilla things. That kind of veil did not exist. The veil was solely for the purpose of covering the face. But they could get a little fancier and a little fancier and a little fancier. Now, it was so difficult to manufacture a seamless tunic. It was so difficult to do that. Only the absolute best weavers could do it. And it was so rare to actually see them, they are truly considered sacred garments, reserved primarily for priests at a temple. Yet Jesus is wearing one. And it's a garment primarily reserved to priests. So if we know that, a seamless garment, and then as they're undressing Jesus to crucify him, and remember for the Jews, naked is really, really bad and shameful. Jesus didn't have a nice little cloth around his waist. Totally naked when they crucified him. Not only do they want to kill him, they want to shame him at the same time. Because if they shame him, anybody associated with him is also shamed as well. And of course, everybody's working real hard not to be associated with them, especially Peter, when he denies Jesus. But because it's recognized as a sacred garment, of course, it tells us something that Jesus is wearing one, a garment usually worn only by a priest, humongously expensive, but it doesn't tell us about Jesus' wealth status at all. But it's important that we notice that when the soldiers saw it was a seamless garment, they did not tear it. Even they recognized it as something sacred. And so they were, very, very careful what they did with it. Last statement, the diet was very, very simple. Rarely did they have meat, dairy, cheese, and fruit was their primary diet. Very rarely did they have meat. They did about 11 o'clock. I've got the mass, so you're not late yet. But they didn't have napkins the way we do, so what did they use for napkins? They used bread. And primarily if you were eating the wheat bread, the barley bread became the way you wiped your hands off. What did they do when they wiped their hands off? Even the dogs eat the bread that falls from the master's table. When this guy's asking for the bread falling from the table, he's asking to eat the napkins that the guy has washed his hands with. So it speaks a lot about the guy's hunger. The person might own 2 cloaks. Not everybody did because they were expensive. Last thing I'll say is this: if the left hand is the toilet hand, they didn't have the same sense of personal space as do we. They standing almost nose to nose when they speak to each other, as they do today. Hardly any sense of personal space. So if you were to slap someone on their right cheek, to get your right hand up there, and it usually was a backhand, to slap a person, that was really hard to prevent, maybe even killing. That's how bad that slap somebody with your toilet hand. So Jesus says, If they slap you on the right cheek, give them your left as well. In other words, let them use their toilet hand to slap you. Don't get tied up. We don't have anything next week. Watch the bulletin, because I am going to, not on the Gospels, but the next thing I'm going to do is talking about how to prepare for dying even though you're not dead yet. You know, it's all the things, all through the years, the things I have witnessed when a family member dies, and all of the stuff I've witnessed after 39 years of doing funerals where things go wrong. You know, it's how does a person in their early 30s, married with a couple kids, how does that person prepare for death that may not come for another 60 years or more? You know, and it's just all the things you need to do. There will be a huge handout for that because it's going to have a checklist of doing all the things you need to do. So anyway, look in the bulletin. I can't promise you it'll be the week after next, but within the next 2 weeks, you know, we will do that. Thank you all. This has been fun. I'll also have a bibliography available about some books that you might find interesting. I'll give that bibliography, well, you'll get it if you want it, and then Trish will be able to order the books at a substantially reduced price for you through the